ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Wyllie. I organised this trip on behalf of the Sydney Institution of Civil Engineers, Eastern region. I thought it might be interesting to come down. In fact, we've got very few civil engineers on board, but I think it's still going to be quite an interesting trip. We've got Peter Roberts from the Environment Agency here, who I hope can answer some questions, if we have any. But the idea is to go down to Aldborough and see the breaches that occurred at Hazelwood.
These repair works there at some point, and that's part of the ongoing discussions with you know, yourselves, residents, and the Alde Estuary Partnership. Where are we now? We're making our way, down to Hazelwood next. Not quite there.
Oh, it's a long way to Hazelwood.
The section that we've just gone past on the left bank is, well, redundant. It was, the walls and etc. were left many years ago, so there was no formal defence line there. That is the back door into the entire Icon flood cell, which is pretty huge. Back in December again, I'm just trying, we're somewhere close to it. If you look over to your right, would have been some very near breaches in the Icon wall. With several hundred acres of land flooded. The breaches did not go all the way down to the salting level to Hazelwood. And Hazelwood marshes was, and still is, very wet and underwater, and did take probably some of the worst damage in the entire estuary. I bought it in January and came in from the east and the west. There were two rather large breaches. I think there might be a third, but we might be able to confirm that today as we sail past it. The entire marshes went under. We had a flood level there of approximately 3 metres ordnance datum, which overtopped the wall massively. The wall there is not particularly high. It has become very difficult over the last 2 or 3 decades to maintain. It has very little saltings in front of it. You know, the incoming outgoing tide is straight up against the wall. There's no natural flood defence in front of it, so it relies very heavily upon the clay embankment and the concrete revetment that was on the front of it. The revetment is notoriously difficult to maintain. It doesn't have a particularly long life, design life, and it takes quite a lot of harsh environment from. It's quite an open part of the estuary, you know, various angles, the fetch, the wind patterns. It takes a real hammering. So yeah, it's taken some bad damage. There's probably several of you involved and know the incomes and outgoings of what's been going on at Hazelwood Marshes, but it is a designated habitat area behind it. We have had so many lengthy conversations with Natural England and back to DEFRA, and it has now been decreed that it can be left in the state that it's in. There will be rather now badly damaged existing defence line. So the marshes, Hazelwood Marshes, are, you know, a large proportion of the land is owned by Suffolk Wildlife Trust. The end that you're now coming up to here, they've got their hide on the western flank of the marshes, and they were investing quite a lot of money there prior to the surge, and were undertaking quite a lot of land drainage and ditching works, and it was no avail now. But I'd like to put a slightly positive twist on it and think, what could you possibly do with that site now? Well, you know, it's a potential, I hate to say it, but a potential gold mine, because if you got the right business hat on, you could look at it from the other perspective of potentially, you know, Suffolk Wildlife Trust could capitalise on it. They could change the habitat that's there and could offer that up. It could become more of an attraction for bird watching, etc., etc. That's part of the issue around how it failed in the first place. You know, the lack of saltings and the lack of natural flood protection in front of it. Clearly the surge side came up and up and up, overtopped the wall. It then proceeded to fill up the entire dry side of the marshes, and I would imagine fairly common failure mechanism can be when the level in the main river that we're on now drops again. There's so much pressure in terms of the head differential between the dry side and the traditional wet side, and plus the fact that the walls would have been weakened from overtopping in the first place. It's quite highly likely that the wall actually failed and pushed out from what is traditionally the dry side back into the river, which slightly goes against logic, as you might think on a surge line. So right over to your left hand side now is one or two of the breaches. The whole bank stretches for something like 2.5 kilometres, just over, and I'd say approximately 80–85% of it is heavily damaged. In some cases you've only got the front face standing, and you've got the concrete block revetment just hanging in midair. The costs of repairing it would be absolutely astronomical. Trying to temporarily seal the breaches is a difficult task. In previous breach scenarios back in the early 90s, the late 70s, we've actually used helicopters and flown in 1-ton sandbags and very small, the army-sized sandbags, and filled breaches that way as a temporary measure, and then you have to drain down the entire marsh. That would take several days into weeks. And the same issue again, there's only one small sluice. You have to get rather large high volume pumps in to get the water out in any rapid motion, and that would be very expensive. And then you've got the costly task of actually repairing about 2 kilometres or so of wall. Strange colour is the effect of salt water. This site's got a very similar scenario. I don't know how many of you know Blakeney Freshers Marshes up in North Norfolk. It's a very similar scenario up that end of the world. It's the other really large place within the Norfolk and Suffolk catchment area that we manage that took vast amounts of damage. Blakeney Freshers is a huge bank, 5 or 6 kilometres, a sort of inverted C shape, and off the top of my head I think it had something like over 20 separate breaches in it. Phenomenal repair costs, and again it doesn't protect anybody's people, it doesn't protect people or property. It is purely environmental designation and grazing marshes. So the value of that land, unfortunately, in terms of the DEFRA spending rules and calculations and formulas, doesn't stack up to be entirely viable. But I believe that we are now in a position to progress some form of adaptation repairs in that area. So there is a small glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. And in terms of finances, we had the Prime Minister doing his rounds after the December surge tide, and a lot was said in the national media and press around what DEFRA and the Environment Agency would be able to fund moving forward. But I can assure you it's not that simple. We have had our fair share of money. As this part of the world goes, we're predominantly rural in nature. We have to compete with the large places such as London. This quickly ties back into high ground here, the hummock of the hill in front of you, and then we pick up the next huge flood cell as we go around the corner on the opposite bank to Aldborough. And that's a massive flood cell which stretches all the way down to past Orford, down to Gedgrave, and returns back up essentially Butley River. This area, as we said, did have a few locations where it did nearly breach, and there was extensive general overtopping. I don't know whether any of you saw it, but I very sadly came around the next day and drove around to vantage points, and you could see very clearly a very different colour in the grass on the wall, and that's simply because that's the area where it was overtopped. So all the grass was laying flat and reflected the light very differently compared to that which was still standing, which was slightly higher. So you could pick out all the areas where it overtopped, and it didn't come out too well on a photograph, but it really was, a real patchwork quilt right along the wall. So you could argue there's probably a reasonable amount of work to do there with bringing all of the wall up to a uniform level instead of it being slightly up and down in places. Again, that's all part of the wider estuary strategy, which I always refer to, but it's called the Futures Project now. No, estuary shed is Brian Upson's boatyard, and I went and measured. He very kindly took a level there on the night of the tide. It was approximately 1.1 metres of standing water in his boat shed, so that was pretty horrific. The levels there were approximately 3.1 metres AOD, if that means anything to anybody. Nonetheless, it was pretty high, pretty wet. To put that into context, some of the levels that we've had previously in this area, Lowestoft is way up on the coast, but Lowestoft is the point that we use in terms of forecasting storm waters and tidal predictions. It's the nearest prediction point. 1953 level at Lowestoft was 3.35 metres. So the Sylvan section here is a challenging bit of coastline, to say the least. If you looked over to your left, you know, the green field on the other side of the wall, there was vast amounts of shingle to the northern end of it. In the section right here by the clubhouse building, we had a lot of erosion of shingle, and you then pick up more green field as you head down towards the Martello Tower. We've had some overtopping and scour on the top of the wall here, and it did start to undermine the slipway up to and down from the Sailing Club Yacht Club. Yeah. Not taking a hammering from a force 7, 8, 9 northeasterly. The water pressure is very different. The hydrostatic pressure on the defences is very different. So I think if we lost this main section of coastal defence, we would have, a very different shape and form to the estuary. And there are many reports and conclusions that some people have come to for that, and It's far more than what I understand and know. I don't profess to be an expert on it by any means, but I think it's pretty obvious if we lose it, the consequences could be quite dire and a little bit unpredictable in some cases. Straightforward process, and we have to be mindful of the environmental designations that we're working within and around and very close to. So we are limited at times with what we can do. The December surge damaged the front face of the main shingle bank. Yeah, okay, the hard soft interface, what does that mean? Well, effectively, you're going from a growing field, which is holding up shingle beach material, it's retaining material, and that in itself dissipates wave energy. It's all around wave energy. So you've got a shingle bank to the south here. Shingle in itself, by its very nature, finds its own what we call natural angle of repose. You pile it up and heap and it will find its own settlement factor and it will sit there and quite happily. But it's just shingle. When it has a 4/7 northeasterly and plus on it, it gets eroded very, very quickly by the sheer wave energy. The groin field and the rock revetment that's in front of some of the rock and kind of the groins and sea wall obviously help take that out on the northern section of the defences, but not so to the south. I've got a very nice photograph, I think from mid-1970s, looking at the Martello Tower going south, and the shingle bank has gone inland by approximately 150-200 metres. That was massive. A big sort of 90-degree inlet almost, and almost breached again. So it is history repeating itself.
Seen him?
Oh, yes! Yes!
Oh, little darling. Yeah.
Thank you.
First seal I've ever seen.